So good morning, everyone, and welcome to Dawn Mountain. It is Sunday, August 6th. We're in the middle of our summer. Welcome. So on Sunday mornings, we have just some short talks that are kind of introductory to some topic in Buddhism, and also introductory to what we do here. So this morning I wanted to read you, this is from a Theravada scripture. It's called the Pabhasara Sutta. It's also in English called Luminous, and the translation is by one Thanissaro Bhikkhu, who is a forest monk. He's still alive. And it's relatively short. I'm not even going to read all of it. I'll read about 2/3 of it. Luminous, monks, is the mind, and it is defiled by incoming defilements. Luminous, monks, is the mind, and it is freed from incoming defilements. Luminous, monks, is the mind, and it is freed from incoming defilements. The well-instructed disciple of the noble ones discerns that as it actually is present, which is why I tell you that for the well-instructed disciples of the noble ones, there is development of the mind. So, a little bit hard to read. It is a translation. The major point is that the mind is luminous. It does get defiled, but for the well-instructed, there is freedom from defilement. And so around this, we can say a lot. The idea that our minds are naturally luminous, this is one of the earliest instances in the early scriptures that shows this. And this goes all the way then into what we can call Tantric Buddhism and Dzogchen Buddhism, where the idea is that not only is our mind luminous, but we are all, by our very nature, enlightened beings. And that's quite a lot to say and quite a lot to talk about. But minimally, we understand in a very, very interestingly democratic way that everyone has a luminous mind. And it's just when we get caught up in things, it gets defiled. And when we don't, and we know how to develop ourselves, there's more luminosity and freedom. So there are two basic ways of getting at the luminosity of the mind on the basis of basic moral behavior. We can develop calm and concentration. And that's the kind of practice we do here at Dawn Mountain on Sundays. We're creating attention, we're doing mindfulness, and that's one kind of luminosity of the mind that is developed. The other is associated with insight and understanding what is our true nature. Can we understand the deepest nature of our being? And it has to do with what are called the insight teachings of Buddhism. And those typically we deal with on Tuesday nights and during our retreats. Calm abiding has a fair bit to do with welfare in this life, can affect things for the future lives as well, beneficially. Insight, it is said in Buddhism, can ultimately free us from a cycle of rebirth. And so it has religious and spiritual significance. So understanding the true nature of the mind, understanding the luminous nature of the mind can have certainly benefits for this life, but overall, in Buddha's teachings and practice, there's a very, very large perspective, and that includes the idea that we can become free from a cycle of rebirth, which, unless we do become free, is powerless and is fraught with pain. So what obstructs the natural luminosity of the mind? In general, pretty close to our everyday experience, when we start clinging to things obsessively, when we get reactively hateful, and when we're just kind of deluded and distracted and kind of mindless, these all obstruct the natural luminosity of the mind. One helpful word to understand in this is the word identification. And identification basically speaks to the idea that we get involved with wanting something so strongly that we lose our self-awareness. We're just kind of driven. We hate somebody or something so much that we're thoroughly absorbed in the hate. Deluded. We're just so zonked out that we're kind of couch potatoes on steroids. Identification is what most of us live in if we haven't really developed any kind of spiritual practice. And the practices of mindfulness that we do on Sunday and the wisdom and insight that we cultivate, that we learn about on Tuesdays and during our retreats, are ways of gaining leverage into an ability to have more self-awareness, more mindfulness, and ultimately freedom, and a freedom that can not only lead to a more settled state in this present life, but also freedom that can lead to a freeing from a cycle of rebirth. For spiritual practitioners and most people in the modern West, one of the most problematic things to become identified with is shame. Now, shame is a very, very interesting emotion. Unlike hatred, unlike desire, many of us actually don't have that much experience with shame. And what's that about? Well, it's about most of us at some point in our life started realizing that shame is so painful that we discovered ways of covering it up. So workaholism is a wonderful way of dealing with shame. Alcohol is a great way of dealing with shame. Becoming religiously obsessed can be a great way of dealing with shame. Any kind of chemical, any kind of addictive behavior, sexual addiction, pornography, gambling, but again, overwork, obsessively reading, studying, all can be ways of coping with shame. So what is shame? And people often get confused. Guilt and shame. Guilt is, I did something wrong. I stepped on your toe. Ideally, I stepped on your toe, I apologize, I'm sorry, and we move on. Shame is the state of not only I did bad, but I am bad. There is something about me that is rotten to the core. most of us have some shame in us, and it is actually important to start to learn how to tolerate it so that we don't get lost in all sorts of secondary behaviors that are covering over the shame. So we have in Texas one expert in Austin, Kristen Neff, who's written a book titled Self-Compassion. And she writes about shame a lot. And in Houston, we have Brene Brown, who talks and writes about shame quite a bit. And Kristen Neff has come up with 3 pieces that are important for considering shame. And the first is mindfulness. So what we do here on Sundays is we develop a very, very simple attentional practice that allows us to be mindful of our breathing, but also to be aware of things are coming up in our experience. And they come up and they disappear, and we're allowing that process to occur. So with shame, the first thing that is important to be able to do is to allow ourselves to experience what shame is like. And it is painful. And it's actually, there's a physiological set of responses. There's the tendency to feel heavy, feel kind of beset. People who are feeling shame will often feel the need to look down. It's hard to look up and look evenly when you're feeling shame. So the first thing is, can you develop some tolerance for actually knowing that you're in a shame state? And the second is to start developing an appreciation for our common humanity. And this has to do with perfectionism, and Brene Brown writes a lot about this, that typically what happens is we do something wrong or something not perfect occurs to us, and instead of just sort of staying with this simple sense of I failed a test or I scratched my car, it shifts from maybe just a simple experience of guilt or mistakenness into an experience of I am fundamentally bad. And so even at a cognitive level, beginning to appreciate our common humanity is a significant avenue of working with shame. Now, those of you who've been around a fairly long time know that we teach and often talk about a practice in Buddhism called Donglen, which is giving and receiving. Offering out and taking on. But one of the aspects of Donglen is when something untoward or painful or suffering is occurring to us, we're aware of it, and we make the aspiration, not only am I stuck with a thorn and my finger is hurting, may I absorb the pain of all sentient beings into myself as I experience this pain. All sentient beings are experiencing pain. May I experience theirs. Now, if that's too much for your emotional and cognitive capacity, minimally, can you experience the pain of that thorn and recognize, first of all beings experience the pain of thorns. All beings scratch their cars. I'm not the only one who scratches my car, my new Mercedes-Benz. Everyone does. Even ants probably have an equivalent experience. So just to appreciate all beings are imperfect. I am imperfect. Can we experience some solace in recognizing how similar we are to everyone else? I was talking to a student yesterday, and they were saying, well, when I first started listening to you, and you just seemed so full of afflictions, how could you possibly be teaching Buddhism? I am full of afflictions. And I try not to make any bones about it. And in Asia, it's done differently. And we're very, very different culturally than our Asian compatriots. In Asia, there is a narrative of perfection. If you read the books, you read traditional Buddhist material, or if you even see how teachings are given, it's pretty much all about what can be and what's optimal, and really the perfection of the teacher. It's a path, it's important, it's useful. But in this culture, I think what's most important is for us to realize that somebody who's sitting up here, has as much desire for a new Lexus as you do, or wants to go get their ice cream at Kroger's afterwards as you do, let alone talk about sexual mayhem. I mean, we're human. And in our culture, it's not useful for you to think that I'm some dude who's wired differently than you are. And it's not useful for any one of us to think that, what typically happens with shame is there's actually an interesting kind of pride involved with shame. It's kind of inverted pride. But if you talk to anybody who's in a shame attack, they're actually the worst person in the world. Well, if you're the best at being worst, that's a kind of pride. It's true. It's a kind of holding to self, which is very, very stubborn. And one of the things we work with when we're dealing with insight is working with, what is this kind of self that we hold on to? Even this idea that we're the worst. And the third thing that Kristen Neff talks about is self-compassion. So it's mindfulness, knowing that you're experiencing shame, 2, common humanity, and then 3, self-compassion. And of course, we teach a lot of compassion practice here on Tuesdays and during our retreats. And it's very, very important for us, especially in the West, to spend some time. May I be free from suffering. May I be happy. And then not only the words, but can we just actually, in a felt kinesthetic manner, if we're feeling something like shame, can we just be with ourselves as an ideal parent would be with their child? it's not a small thing, and it's not something we should be passing over. We do need to be attending to ourselves with kindness and space. And speaking for myself, I know that probably one of my favorite ways of dealing with shame or dealing with life is, workaholism. So taking the time and the space to be kind to myself, that means I've got to slow the engine down. And most people here are pretty workistic. So taking the time when you're feeling shame to really be kind to yourself, it's very, very important. It is a true story that we had a colleague who was a monk who went off on a retreat to develop compassion. And he literally did say, gosh, all these people came by and they were annoying me. And why weren't they leave me alone so that I could develop compassion? We are all amazing. But at some level, he couldn't offer himself the soothing that was necessary when he got distressed by other people annoying him. How significant, how important, how big a missing piece in our practice if we don't spend and attend to ourselves and learning how to soothe ourselves when other people do things that annoy us. That's an ongoing challenge. It's very nitty-gritty, very concrete, and very, very significant. So just to reiterate what I reviewed today, we looked at the Pabhasara Sutta, the luminous. It's in the Anguttara Nikaya. It's available online. I mentioned that there are really two ways of cultivating luminosity, one having to do with calm and attention, and one having to do with insight. That here at Dawn Mountain, on Sundays, we tend to deal with the calm and attention practice on Sunday morning from 11 to 12, and insight. We do some calming on Tuesday nights and in our retreats, but we do a lot about insight in our Tuesday nights and in our retreats. That what obstructs our luminous mind are the kind of three major obstructions of clinging and hatred and deludedness. And those all get operational when we identify with some state of clinging or hatefulness or deludedness. That this issue of the luminous mind and developing it has consequences not only for this life but also future lives, and especially practice of insight is said to liberate us from an endless swirl of cyclic rebirth. So there's a religious and spiritual significance to cultivating insight and the insight associated with the luminous mind. And that in the everyday world, one of the biggest obstructions to our luminous mind is shame, that it's very, very common amongst all of us, and it's very, very common among spiritual practitioners, and that it's often hidden to the point where we don't necessarily even know we're experiencing shame. And so mindfulness can be useful in bringing to awareness that we are in fact experiencing shame. And two, it's important for us to be aware of any perfectionism we may have, and that we are in fact share the vulnerability of being human with all other human beings. And that if you're interested, Kristen Neff has written a book called Self-Compassion, and Brene Brown locally, I think she has around 3 books now, and there are some TED Talks that are available for free. Brene Brown. And finally, it is important for us to develop a skill and facility with self-compassion, especially when we're experiencing something like shame, where we are just taking the time and the open-heartedness to feel kind towards ourselves. So I'll leave you with that for this morning talk, and we'll take a few-minute break, and then we'll reassemble for some meditation.